The first call alerting the royal family to Diana's accident, less than 3 weeks after that photo call, came through to Balmoral at 1 o'clock on the morning of Sunday 31 August 1997. Later that day, William and Harry had been due to fly to London, and Tiggy Legge Burke had, as the Queen said, by the grace of God, just arrived to accompany them. The holidays were almost over and Diana was flying back from Paris to spend the last few days with the boys, as she always did before the start of the new term. The call came through to Sir Robin Yanran, then the Queen's deputy private secretary, who was fast asleep in his house on the estate. It was from the British ambassador in Paris, who had only sketchy news. There had been a car crash. Dodi Fayed, with whom Diana had been travelling, had been killed, although there was no confirmation. Diana had been injured but no one knew how badly. Their car had smashed into the support pillars of a tunnel under the Seine. It had been travelling at high speed while trying to escape a group of paparazzi in pursuit on motorbikes. Yanran immediately woke the Queen and the Prince of Wales in their rooms at the castle. He then phoned the Prince's assistant private secretary, Nick Archer, who was in another house on the estate, as well as the Queen's equerry and PPOs. They agreed to meet in the offices at the castle, where they set up an operations room and manned the phones throughout the night. Meanwhile, in London, the Prince's team were being woken and told the news, ironically, by the tabloid press. The first call to Mark Bolland, the Prince's deputy private secretary, came at the same time as the embassy was on to Yanran. It was from the News of the World. Having had a very good dinner, Bolland let the answering machine take the call, and it was only when he heard the voice of Stuart Higgins, then editor of The Sun, saying something about an accident that he picked up the phone. Higgins had the same story as the embassy. Higgins then rang Sandy Henny, the Prince's press secretary, who had just hosted a 40th birthday dinner for her sister-in-law. His call was closely followed by one from Clive Goodman from the News of the World. Bolland alerted Stephen Lamport, the Prince's private secretary, and within minutes the lines between London and Scotland were buzzing. Plans were underway to get the Prince on a flight to Paris as soon as possible to visit Diana in hospital, when the embassy rang at 3:45 with an update. It was left to Robin Yanran to ring the Prince and let him know his plans would have to change. "Sir, I am very sorry to have to tell you, I've just had the ambassador on the phone. The Princess died a short time ago. She had sustained terrible chest and head injuries and lost consciousness very soon after the impact and never regained it. She was treated in the wreckage of the Mercedes at the scene for about an hour and was then taken to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital 4 miles away, where surgeons fought for a further 2 hours to save her life, but in vain. The Prince's first thought was for the children. Should he wake them or let them sleep and tell them in the morning? He was absolutely dreading it, and didn't know what to do for the best. The Queen felt strongly that they should be left to sleep, and he took her advice and didn't wake them up until 7:15. But while they were sleeping, he sneaked into the nursery and removed their radios and televisions from their rooms, in case they woke up early, and switched one of them on. William had a difficult night's sleep and woke up many times. He knew, he said, that something awful was going to happen. There was much discussion about how Charles was going to get to Paris to bring home Diana's body. She was no longer a member of the royal family. Therefore it was not automatic that a plane of the Queen's flight should be made available. "What would you rather, ma'am?" asked Robin Yanran, "that she come back in a Harrods van?" That clinched it. Operation Overlord went into action, a plan that had been in existence for years but never previously needed. The return of a body of a member of the royal family to London. There was a Bay 146 plane earmarked for the purpose, which could be airborne at short notice from RAF Northolt. At 10 a.m. it was in the air with the Prince's London team, Lamport, Bolland and Henny, on its way to Aberdeen, via RAF Wittering in Rutland, where it collected Diana's sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, who lived nearby, and Lady Jane Fellows. Charles had telephoned Robert Fellows, who had broken the news to Diana's sisters, and they both wanted to travel with him. He decided that this was not a trip for the children, and so they stayed at Balmoral with Tiggy. When he saw their mother's body, laid out in a coffin which had been flown to Paris earlier in the day, as part of Operation Overlord. He was glad he'd left them behind. It would have been too distressing for them. Paul Burrell, Diana's remaining butler, had flown out earlier and dressed her, but her head had been badly damaged in the crash and her face was distorted. Diana's sisters and Charles stayed with the body for 7 minutes. The girls left sobbing. Charles, his eyes red and his face racked with pain, stopped for a moment to compose himself. Then, as someone watching remarked, went from human being to Windsor, as nearly 50 years of training ensured he would. A small crowd was waiting in the corridor, most of them hospital staff whose hands he shook and thanked sincerely for everything they had done. And when he heard that the parents of the sole survivor of the crash, Al Fayed's bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, were at the hospital, he immediately said he must talk to them. On the flight home, with the coffin draped in the maroon and yellow of the royal standard, the prince wanted to know what arrangements had been made at the other end. It had been an emotional and moving drive through Paris where thousands of people thronged the streets, their heads bowed in silence. He was told who would be among the welcoming committee at Northolt, which included Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, and that the princess would be taken to the mortuary in Fulham, commonly used by the royal coroner. The prince put his foot down. "Who decided that?" he said. "Nobody asked me. Diana is going to the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Sort it. I don't care who has made this decision. She is going to the Chapel Royal." It was sorted out in a series of heated telephone conversations from the plane, and when they touched down at Northolt the rest followed seamlessly. Diana's sisters travelled with the body to the Chapel Royal and Charles took a flight back to Balmoral to be with William and Harry. It was only as the hearse and its entourage crawled down the A40 and into West London that the enormity of what had happened began to dawn on the palace staff. The motorway, the bridges and embankment, and when those ran out, the roads and pavements, were full of cars and people who had come to watch and weep as Diana's coffin passed by. Tributes had started pouring in from all over the world, and flowers were being laid at the gate of every building with which Diana was associated. This, they realized, was going to be unlike anything anyone had ever seen before.